Alright, and now it's time for our US review and cross-Atlantic discussion of Avengers Age of Ultron.
So you'll remember previously we had our part 1 and 2 reviews in which Andre, who had been lucky enough to see the movie in his native Norway, had seen a very early showing, and we got a chance to hear about the movie before it even came to the UK. So today, having seen the movie, I'll also be able to pitch in my opinions on it. But first, Andre has some information on the box office numbers that have come out of this, particularly domestically in the US.
Absolutely. Before we move into the domestic bit of it, let's begin with the international aspects, because it's now been released globally for 12 days, and it's currently out in 77% of its markets. At the time of this recording, it has earned $626.7 million, which is about 7% higher than the first Avengers movie was at the same point in release. In the US, however, the movie has, in some sense, underperformed. The first Avengers opened to $207.4 million, which is the highest opening weekend of all time. Now, with 3 years of Marvel brand building and worth of inflation happening in the meantime, some estimated that this movie would open to $230 million. But now the final estimates are in, and it appears to only open to about $187.7 million, which is kind of disappointing given that it's 20 million behind the first movie. That being said, it is still the second biggest opening weekend of all time, and Disney is then in the lucky position to have the top 3 opening weekends of all time, with the Avengers Age of Ultron, and Iron Man 3. Anyway, this underperformance can be due to several things. It might have something to do with word of mouth, because the Thursday previews were actually higher, much higher than the original Avengers, but then the movie was far softer on Saturday and Sunday, which might be due to word of mouth. What do you think about that, Kevin?
Yeah, and I think that word of mouth really played a lot. I kind of wish I'd taken a little more of that word of mouth to heart myself. I mean, I knew I was going to want to see this movie either way. I'm not part of the audience that could usually take or leave Avengers. I mean, I'm going to see Avengers for sure. If I'd taken it more to heart, maybe my expectations would have been a little bit more tempered, because my overall impression of the movie right now is, I had fun at the theater, I enjoyed the movie. There were lots of parts I was not thrilled about, though, and as I've kind of sat here thinking about it, my impression has kind of even slid a little bit further, and I think that's probably just because, the original set up such high expectations. It's such a great movie. There's, you sit down to watch the Avengers and you're thinking, oh, I can't wait for this scene and that scene, and when this happens. But in this newer one, I don't know if there's any particular scene I'm super excited to see again. It's kind of unnerving for an Avengers movie.
No, I can definitely see where you're coming from. It doesn't really have any of those really crowd-pleasing moments. You can see that this shot in the beginning of the movie, the one where you see all of them jumping forward in Eastern Europe in slow motion, that was meant to be one of those holy shit moments, and the same with Captain America throwing his spike, but it kind of fell flat in a way, and it wasn't all that memorable as they were no doubt hoping. Like, magic didn't strike.
Yeah, it felt very forced, that big jump moment. I mean, I can see why they had hoped for it, but didn't quite do it after the just the explosiveness of how exciting it was to see all these guys in action together for the first time in the first Avengers. But one thing that was unique to this movie that you can't say you saw in another movie was, at least not another Avengers movie, was Ultron. And, I think that was one of the points of this movie I was most excited about. Because while I wouldn't say I would watch anything that James Spader was in, I mean, there's certainly lots of things I would not watch him in. But for a Marvel movie, for this soft-spoken, menacing villain, he was perfect. He should, and it worked out pretty good on the film. I don't know. I mean, there's kind of this neuroticness to him. And I would have. My hope for a villain is usually that they're going to have some kind of philosophy that strings the whole thing together for them. You've got Lex Luthor and you've got the Joker, and these guys have a way they see the world, and it constantly plays out. I was disappointed to see that Ultron himself was very inconsistent.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. Ultron is a very unique villain, certainly compared to what we've seen in the Marvel universe before, because he seems a little bit all over the place in some sense. Because he had like this whole theme going with there being no strings on him. And what does that mean? That he's free to ruin the world, and to what end? Like, what drives him? Why does he do that? Just because he can? Of course, James Spader made him excellent and made him memorable, and I don't think he would have been nearly as interesting if anyone but James Spader had voiced him. But he's certainly a change of pace compared to the usual Marvel villains, where you know exactly what's their end game. That was not clear with Ultron at all. You even saw his lackeys. They weren't even sure what he wanted. Like, they thought that they had common goals to begin with, but then it turned out that Ultron was playing his own game all along. A game that none of us were really privy to, not even towards the end of the movie.
There was a moment where I felt like I might have understood, where there's this line he mentions about God throwing a stone at the earth, and that was bound to happen, that people couldn't see what was coming. And I figured myself that was a reference to Thanos coming, and that he wanted to kind of level the earth so that he could rebuild it up, sort of like the Marine mantra of tearing a person down only so you can build them back better than ever, sort of with a single-minded strength. But throughout the movie, I felt like that wavered a lot. Like, that wasn't his constant goal. I mean, sometimes it was just fury, sometimes it was just ego. And for me personally, even though I see that this was probably very intentional on their part, it still just didn't work for me. I still just didn't enjoy it as much as some of those other Marvel villains, even though James Spader's performance was very good for what the role was.
It also harkens back to his rather confusing origins, because we know that he came to be with essentially the mathematical formulas and codes, which for some reason was within the Soul Gem, was extracted and merged with the Ultron protocols written by Tony Stark, and from that came Ultron. And what was unclear to me is, okay, what's the mix? Did Ultron really come from the Soul Gem with just some protocols written by Tony Stark? Or was he all Tony Stark who suddenly got a fuse of life from the Soul Gem? Even that was unclear. So he's in some sense the most mysterious villain so far, because we really don't know where to place him. We don't know where he came from. We don't know his end game. And we don't know what else we don't know, essentially.
Yeah, we don't know what questions to even ask.
Exactly.
So while I did more or less, I was entertained by Ultron, for me personally, could have hit the spot a little harder, but I recognize that could just be me. So one other thing that about this movie that kind of threw me off was that there wasn't the best utilization of characters. I could get to lots of different characters, but there's too many characters in this movie to touch upon. I think I would just get to the one that was the biggest shame for me, which was that Anthony Mackie's usage as the Falcon was pretty shameful. He needed some bigger scenes. I don't know why he couldn't have been in some of these action scenes, even if he'd just been one more character there to punch and throw and shoot bad guys. I mean, that's what half the characters in the movie were there to do, including War Machine, who was somewhat better used, even though he's not one of the biggest focuses of the Marvel universe. His presence is always appreciated, which it was here too. But it just kind of brings to mind that moment from the first Iron Man movie where Rhodey says he walks by the War Machine armor and he says, what does he say? Next time, baby, or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's those exact words.
And then that's kind of the same thing with Falcon here. We got a little shot of him jumping in place, flinging his wings through the air towards the end of the movie, and he was at the party that the Avengers had early in the movie, kind of celebrating their victory with them. But ultimately, I just would have liked to have seen more of him doing what superheroes actually do.
I would have liked one scene where we saw his change of heart, because you mentioned that in the beginning of the movie he's at this party where he makes it very clear to Captain America that avenging is not for him. Cap sticks to the avenging and he'll do whatever he does. And then next we see him is in the final scene where suddenly he's an Avenger. So he either must have had a pretty great change of heart, or he was just playing hard to get for Captain America, hoping to get the call for the Avengers all along. Either way, I would have liked to seen at least one more scene with him to fill the gap between those two scenes.
Definitely, and it's not that there couldn't be bigger things from him in the next movie. I think that's very much what they were implying, and maybe this reference to trying to track down cold cases, missing people, maybe that'll play out in some bigger way down the road. But I would have liked to have seen something more. But here's my biggest problem with the movie, and probably where I set myself up the most, was with Black Widow's treatment. So in Captain America, the Winter Soldier, I felt like Black Widow was the best she'd ever been on screen. I mean, she was kind of grimly funny, but she was also very brief, and they just used very effectively and had some really great action sequences in the Winter Soldier. And to see her so motionless, I mean, in a lot of scenes she's just hanging out talking. I mean, she gets a motorcycle scene here and there. It's kind of towards the middle of the movie, but not really what I would call a good usage of a comic book character. There should be fighting. There should be real change of the direction of the plot at her hands, and she just kind of felt like she was around for the ride. Making her what was on screen, what was sort of there, was that she was the mom of the team.
Indeed, but I do have a theory of what might have happened there, because what we learned was that Scarlett Johansson was pregnant during the shoot of the movie. I think she was 4 or 5 months as the shoot began, and she certainly wouldn't be any less pregnant as the shoot progressed, and this was a fairly long shoot. So I think that they had to last minute restructure the movie to address her pregnancy, to kind of hide it. They couldn't give her too many action scenes, because if they did, it would be very obvious a stunt woman was performing them. So I think that might be part of the reason, but obviously not the entire explanation, because the character clearly took a step back from where we've seen her before. She did become kind of the mom of the team, as you hinted at, but they kind of took it a little bit too far. And I also don't think it really worked.
No, and I think part of the reason for that is because Black Widow's not really ever been a nurturing type of character in the comics. I mean, she's somebody who very much has her own agenda. Now, she's not evil. I mean, I'm not certainly suggesting that because she's not a nurturing figure that there's something wrong with her. On the contrary, she's sort of following in Nick Fury's shoes of doing the wrong thing at the right time, perhaps, and in some instances. And in other instances, she gets to play the hero a little bit more. But just for this character to sort of take that stance, it didn't settle well with me. But I also have to acknowledge that Scarlett Johansson adding another member to her family is not a bad thing. I don't want to imply that she ruined the movie. I just would have liked to have seen Marvel handle this in a slightly different way. I would have taken more of a chance with the stunt woman, frankly. The other part of this, also tying into the mom thing, is the lullabies aspect of the movie. Now, we've seen in the past that Bruce Banner has no problem becoming the Hulk. Sure, you could slap him around and make him mad and he'll turn into the Hulk, but he's also capable of triggering it himself because he's a very angry person. But the hard part of this to me was watching Scarlett Johansson sort of coddle the Hulk out of being the Hulk and into being Bruce Banner. I almost would have rather not seen this explained on screen, how they get him to stop being the Hulk, because because to me, and I know it's probably just me, but the whole lullaby aspect was the worst part of any Marvel movie produced to date.
Well, I know one more who agrees with you, and that is Betty Ross. But that aside, I actually really like that. You have like this trope in science fiction and fantasy generally, how the monster can be calmed down by a beautiful young woman who is his kryptonite, essentially. And that clearly is the case here as well. But I kind of liked it. I didn't mind it in the slightest. I think that the direction that they're going with this fling between Banner and Black Widow is a pretty good idea. And yeah, I think they handled it fairly well. I think this is something that's going to create some level of controversy where people will take one stance or the other. But I certainly liked it, and I think those two characters in some ways are very similar. So I feel it worked.
And I'll get on to the last element of my Black Widow critique, which is the line that I really didn't like in the movie. And perhaps there's more to this line, but I think the implication, even the knowing implication that... So by Black Widow saying this line, I'll just preface this here. By Black Widow saying this line, it doesn't mean she's literally a monster, but that the character thinks she's a monster because she's sterile. This really bothered the hell out of me. I mean, we're talking about Hulk. I mean, you could make the argument that Hulk, at least, even if we're not talking about Bruce Banner in that same sentence, the Hulk is a monster. The Hulk is just a big green rage monster who tears things apart when he's not happy. And he's always not happy. I mean, that's just the point of the character. This is why he's always miserable, he's always destructive. And that somehow Black Widow would think of herself in the same way because she's sterile, being equivalent, that's screwed up. And I honestly didn't even think it had a place in this movie.
Now I can see where you're coming from. And when you look at that line, isolated, taken out of context, it's really horrible. But within context, I can kind of see where she's coming from, because she says it in the context that she's a trained KGB agent, an assassin, and she's trained to kill, she's trained to only focus on the mission, and to become an agent she had to get sterilized. Not voluntarily, this is something she was forced to do. And why? Well, because then there would be no future distractions. There would be nothing to take her mind away from the mission. And she sees herself as a monster because of it. But in reality, she's a victim. And the monsters were the ones who did this to her. But she's so screwed up that she doesn't really see it that way. She's too damaged. And this is also what she has in common with Banner. He's also a victim of the Hulk. And the Hulk, in his turn, is also a victim of Banner. And they're both victims of the system and circumstances that led to their mutual creation. So you have other monsters, and they're the victims, but still they see themselves as monsters, and they punish themselves for it. And that is something that Banner and Black Widow have in common. And within that context, the line kind of makes sense, because there's more to it than just the words. But I agree that in some sense it's unfortunate because it does come off in the wrong way.
And perhaps that's one of these things that's really on me. I just as a person, I hate seeing this notion that so many people are victims. I mean, I'm not even saying it's not true. It's just if you stop and hold up these characters and say, look how victimized they are, it kind of takes away from their ability just to stand tall and look strong. I mean, Black Widow is certainly a character who has no problem taking charge of a situation and turning it the way it needs to go, which is a wonderful trait to see in a person, just to kind of assertively fix something that's viciously wrong, and I guess just every time we delve into the territory of these characters being portrayed as victims, I lose a little bit of the fun involved in the movie. Not that everything has to be fun, but for Avengers, come on.
Yeah, I can see that, but that also kind of goes into the problem with the movie, that we learn more about the characters and we see more about their emotional aspect and their personality. But maybe we shouldn't see too much. There is such a thing as learning too much. We need to have some level of mystery. We shouldn't know them too well. I think we struck a balance really well in the previous movie where Black Widow was featured, which was Captain America the Winter Soldier. And then I think about this scene in particular where Captain America puts her to the wall and he asks her, "Don't you know everything?" or something like it. And she answers, "I don't know. I don't know everything. I just pretend I do," which I thought said more about the character than anything else could, and it said everything we needed to know right there. I think that's the way of doing it, whereas here they just push it a little bit too far.
So one observation that we had batted around just a little bit was the notion of this movie not really being its own movie, standing on its own 2 feet. You know, it's a movie that's kind of meant to link the first Avengers movies and perhaps the other, Phase 2 movies to the next phase of Marvel movies.
Yeah, it kind of comes across as a phase of its own, because so much is happening in this movie. I've heard it compared to Iron Man 2, and I think that is a fair comparison. Because like Iron Man 2, this movie does a great job in setting up things to come. In the case of Iron Man 2, that was the Avengers. In this movie, it's setting up Captain America Civil War. It's setting up Thor Ragnarok. It's maybe setting up Guardians of the Galaxy 2, depending on where the Hulk reappears. And it's definitely setting up the Avengers Infinity Wars. But in all this setting up, it kind of neglects to tell its own story. That kind of gets pushed to the background. And that is a weakness with the movie.
You know, you actually touched on something there I meant to address more directly. So when we had released our first video talking about this movie, the spoilers within the movie, we got a little bit of criticism about what really happened with the Hulk. The assertion had been that the Hulk had gone to space, and then the assertion from these commenters on the internet is, no, that's not what happened. And I would like to say, having seen the movie, I thought it was very ambiguous what happened, and I still think that the whole having gone to space angle is still very plausible. I don't know how anybody saw that as an open and shut case of, no, he didn't go to space. Well, you didn't see him go to space, but then again, you didn't really see where he went.
No, exactly. We heard of this thing being dropped in the ocean around Fiji, but we have no idea if that was Hulk. That could be anything. And besides, it's still Banner in there. I'm quite sure that if he wanted to MacGyver that thing to go into space, he could.
Absolutely. And, you know, if my experience with Nick Fury is any indication, and I'm not being facetious about this, I'm being dead on, I just don't trust Nick Fury that much. And so even if he thought it wasn't the Quinjet, he still might not say what it was. Perhaps this is just a way for him to motivate Black Widow to do something. And even if he was being honest, he didn't know that it was the Quinjet. It just could have been. So I don't know. I just think there's enough open here that, yes, this could totally still be a way that the Hulk is going into space. And there's no reason to discount that at this stage.
Exactly. The most important thing that did was to keep the Hulk away from Captain America's Civil War. He does not appear in the comics of that series, and he is unlikely to appear in the movie. Where will he appear the next time? We really have no way of knowing. It seems a little bit far-fetched that Quinjet is going into outer space. But it's the Marvel Universe. Anything can happen. Who knows where a wormhole is going to show up, or if Thanos will do something, or if Ultron did something, who knows?
We just don't
We'll
know.
just
It's
have to
anybody's
wait and
guess.
see. Exactly. All we can say for sure is that he won't be in Captain America Civil War.
Right.
And I'd put my money on him being in Guardians of the Galaxy 2 next, that he'll suddenly show up there.
Right. And I think
we'll wait and see.
definitely the second part of Infinity War, I'd be surprised if he didn't show up for it.
I think he's going to have a huge presence there. Like in the comics, they just finished the Thanos versus Hulk miniseries, and I don't think that was a random accident that they just happened to publish that now.
Cool.
Awesome.
Well, my final thoughts on the movie, I'd give it a 6 out of 10. I felt happy that I was glad to have seen it to the theater. I don't like going to the theater too much, but that it felt appropriate to see this at the theater, and it was actually a good showing, so I was very happy with that. But if I hadn't seen this, it probably would have been okay. Even though I wouldn't skip a Marvel movie at this point. I'm not that jaded on it yet. But if I hadn't seen this, I think I could have missed it and not really felt too out of place when we roll around to the next Marvel feature.
Yeah, I think we won't be able to say for sure until we see the next Marvel feature. We probably wouldn't have missed anything with Ant-Man, but with Captain America Civil War, maybe. But in seeing the movie on its own, I agree, it was kind of missable.
So, I'd still say, if you've got some time to kill looking for something to do this weekend, sure, go see it. Just temper your expectations so that you don't think you're about to see as Andre would put it, the second coming of cinema.
Think of it as you're going to see the new version of Iron Man 2, which still has some kick-ass moments and is important for what is to come, and then you're going to be fine.
Thank you for staying up to finish that. I know it's getting super late over there.
Yeah, it's about midnight now, so we're actually at Midnight's Edge.
For more great podcasts, news, and reviews, visit our site at midnightsedge.net and follow us on Twitter at midnightsedge. Also check out our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/midnightsedge.